y'all, and welcome back to the Apothecary. It is the 10th of December. It is so cold, it's snowing. We've all been full of the flu for the last week. Mommy is crocheting snoots for the girls after watching the Wednesday series, binge watching while we were ill. We're crocheting little Christmas gifts, but more than anything, we are making an amazing 3-mushroom hot and sour soup to help kick this flu in the bum. It's full of so many goodies. 2 wonderful mushrooms that I got from the market while I was in Chester doing the Christmas shopping. Loads of leftover bits out of our garden. We've had our first frost officially now, but we've also got this giant garlic I got at that same market, the giant ginger I got, 1 onion that I think I'm going to start with because there isn't normally onion in this, and we've got some butter and some olive oil. They're going to be our kind of bases. We've also got the Himalayan pink sea salt, the ground black pepper, the chili garlic flakes, soy sauce, and some oyster sauce. For some of the greens, we went and harvested what was probably going to die over soon anyway. So we've got some wonderful Swiss chard with the red stems. We've got a few baby kale leaves that are on the smallest plant, some bok choy, and some of the onion stapes from the onions. They're still, I think I can get another week out of them, but they're happy. We've got I think they're called Shimeji white mushrooms. Again, I got this from that beautiful fruit and veg shop in Chester. We've also got the Enoki mushrooms, which I got there. Now, normally I'd pop in some shiitake or some oyster mushrooms at this point, but I didn't have any. So I'm just going to use these button mushrooms as they still kind of have that beefy texture that they apply to it. And this is a meat-free dish. And of course, I have my freshly sharpened by hubby kitchen sword, which I love. And we're going to start with this 1 onion. Once I've chopped it up, I will have a better idea of whether or not this is enough. Obviously, as I always say, please follow safe knife rules. I don't always do so in my video, so this is all about the ingredients and the taste, and it was actually amazing at the end. So don't copy what I do, just this is for inspiration. So I'm going to finely chop these onions as I don't want them to be predominant in the dish. I want them to be more like the enoki mushrooms and be kind of close to the noodles so that they all mix together. And I didn't mention at the beginning, but I will be doing a version. It doesn't always work well. Sometimes if you get it just right, you can actually make the noodles. I've got this giant clove that I mentioned, so I'm going to break off a couple of these cloves, and I'll probably use between 3 and 4 of these. These ones are really tasty. It's not quite an elephant garlic, and it's not quite the normal garlic that I propagate, but it is much larger. So once you've given those blunt ends a snip and pulled off as much of the residual outside layer as you can, the best thing to do with these, and I am going to be putting all of the bits that come off this meal tonight because it is a completely vegetarian meal. All these bits will be going in a separate bowl, and they'll be going in my mushroom compost heap because we'll have all those leftover ends of mushrooms, and they should still have the mycelium in them. So hopefully not only will I get an awesome mushroom compost, but I'll also get, hopefully if I leave it go long enough, some mushrooms at the end of it. So once I've got all these ends off, I'm just going to give them a good crush, which not only helps you remove the excess peel, but it also helps to break down those cell walls and release more of those garlicky oils. So I'm going to give them a rough chop. Remember, this is going to be cooking for a while, so they will soften down. If you make them too small, they might burn in this initial process, and you can't actually make them too big because they do soften down. Then we've got this giant chunk of ginger. Now, I am more of a fan of ginger than anyone else in the house, so I'm just going to use this small toe end. And because this one has been left to mature, the peel is quite thick, so I am going to peel the skin off when I'm flavoring kombuchas and stuff like that, especially if it's ginger I've harvested out of the garden. I just take a spoon, give it a rough peel, give it a good clean, obviously, and then chuck it straight in, because I know what it's grown in. I know it's completely 100% organic and pesticide free, so I'm quite happy to chuck it in, same as I do with my apples when I'm making apple cider vinegar. If they've come off my mini orchard, and it is a mini orchard, I only got midget trees, so we possibly get 2 dozen of each every year. So I've just cut that quite finely, and now I've got my pan, and I've got it on about a 4 at the moment, which is actually a medium low, because I don't want to start too hot. I do not want to burn that butter off. So I've just got about a tablespoon of butter, and maybe about a tablespoon. Oh, I've got scratches in my pan that always make me think there's hairs in there. And about a tablespoon and a half of olive oil. There are other oils you can use at this point, but I didn't have sesame seed oil or anything like that I could use. So I'm just going to let that heat up and let that butter and oil melt together. While that's doing its thing, my inner Virgo will make me sort everything into little piles in the order that they need to go in. So next, as I said, I'd normally use shiitake or oyster mushrooms for this section, but I couldn't source them at this point. Those stems I will be breaking off. At some points, I use them to propagate mycelium to grow more mushrooms, or I will add them to the compost heap to help with the mushroom soil that I'm trying to develop. Or other times I'll just dehydrate them and they'll go into the powder or the broth for the, soup broth, or to add to soups and stuff like that. I have one little lady who doesn't actually like the texture of mushrooms, but if I make it into a powder and add it to soups, she's none the wiser and she loves the taste. So those I'm just going to cut into strips. I did decide that I needed more onion and I wanted a little bit of a different taste to that. So I've got this red onion, which I think will be great. So I'm just going to cut that up exactly the same as I did that white onion. I do want to keep them quite thin. I don't want them to be a main character in the soup, but I would like them to help with the caramelization on the bottom with the garlic and the ginger, in order to, make that broth a little tastier, I guess. And then next we have the one of the 2 stars of the show, and it's the Shimeji mushrooms. Now, these still have the substrate on the bottom, so they literally have just been cut off fresh where they've been grown, which is amazing. Now, the stems of these are really quite long, and I don't want that in this meal. I have been known to just cut the stems up or slice them lengthways and put them in instead of the noodles, but I'm just going to cut the button bits off, or the tops, the caps, the hoods, at about half an inch, maybe a little bit longer. The extra end bits I am going to keep to dehydrate. They can either go into a broth later again or into that powdered mushroom powder. The end section, well, they're going onto the compost heap again to make some more wonderful mushroom compost. I did have success with it last year, and we did have some mushrooms sprouting out, but I'd used mushrooms that I'd foraged, and some of them that popped up, I wasn't too sure on identification. So as that was just going to be used to fertilize the ground where my plants were going to go, I did not eat those mushrooms. This year, however, I am keeping this compost heap separate, and I'm only using mushrooms that I know are 100% edible, so that we can actually have a edible mushroom harvest from those. Hopefully this compost will probably sit for another 6 months anyway before it gets used, so fingers crossed we'll get a couple of flashes of mushrooms before I need to use the actual compost itself. I think I mentioned earlier that I have already taken samples of both the Shimeji and the Enoki mushrooms to try and inoculate some wheat seeds, I think they're called, so that I can grow those. Now I have my Enoki mushrooms, and I have given these a good wash before I put them back in the bag, but there are still a few little bits. Again, as this meal is only for Daddy and I, and there are so many other bits going on, I'm only adding about a handful of each of those mushrooms. So now that oil is coming along really nicely. Now the Enoki mushrooms are really long and thin, and they cook down quite a bit. They do actually have kind of a noodly consistency. So I'm just going to add my onions. Now I have turned my heat up to a medium now. I'm not looking to caramelize those onions straight away. I do want them to get quite soft first, so translucent first. While that is doing its thing, I'm just going to separate off the Enoki mushrooms. And as I said, they are quite long. I do want them to have that feel to them, but I am still going to chop them in half. And again, like the Shimeji, these ones do still have the substrate on the end. I'll see what I'll do with that. That'll probably just go in the compost heap. But these separate so easily. The air is filled with the beautiful smell of frying onions, so that tells me that these are almost ready. So I'm just going to give them one last good stir, make sure everything is nice and soft, and then in with our garlic. Now, as you can see, those 3 full cloves, 3.5 cloves that I used actually made quite a bit of garlic there. So again, I'm going to give that a good stir before I add anything else. I do want the onions to soak up all the different flavors. My favorite part about this meal is, even though there's so much in there, once it is cooked up, you can still taste all those different flavors separately as well as the meal together. And that sizzling sound is just what we need. These onions are nice and soft, so it's time to go in with our ginger. Again, giving that a good stir in. Now, our button mushrooms are the biggest, the most fibrous, and they do have the longest cooking time. So I'm putting those sliced mushrooms in first, and I'll allow them to soften for a little bit, giving them a stir, let them do their thing. I'm just going to season with some salt. We always use pink Himalayan sea salt. Obviously use the salt you have, and some nice ground black pepper, and some of the chili and garlic from the grinder. Again, I don't want the big seeds in, as I'm the biggest chili fan. No one else is. Then in with our Shimeji mushrooms. Now, as they are whole, they again take a little bit longer to cook than the Enoki. We want a splash. I used just under a tablespoon at this point of soy sauce and just a small dash of the oyster sauce. We will be tasting as we go and adding what we need. So at this point, I'm starting little and we will build it up from there. So everything is nice and incorporated. And I'm just going to bring this into the middle. Now, unfortunately, my wok is so large, I don't have a lid for it. So I'm just going to use this large round glass one. It isn't very hard, so there isn't much risk of it cracking. But I'm just going to leave this to simmer low and soften up while I cut the rest of the ingredients. Now, the chard, those stems are quite woody and they don't really soften down that well when they're whole like this. So what I do is just cut the stems out from the leaf. I decided to use 2 instead of the 3. Now, not only do I love the flavor of these, but they also add a wonderful red color. And as long as you cut them down nice and fine like this, obviously you could cut them lengthways if you wanted more of the noodle effect. But as long as you cut them down small like this, they do actually soften up quite well. I'm going to do the same with those few green onion greens or onion greens that I had rather. Again, I would much rather have used spring onions, but I'm making do with what I have in my garden. Then I'm going to give those little bok choy leaves a chop. I did actually I had some small plants left over, so I brought them into the conservatory. Unfortunately, it's not heated in there, so they're not growing a lot, but at least they haven't been affected by the frost. Same with those kale leaves. And then again with those beautiful charred greens. And as it's in a soup and it is going to cook down quite a bit, I'm just giving them a rough chop. Said not only are they for the goodness, they're also for the colour and just a little bit of more vegetable texture in there, as if the mushrooms weren't enough. So this is sat down and it has simmered under that cover for about 5 minutes. I'm now adding the Enoki mushrooms. I'll give them a good mix in first, make sure everything's nice and incorporated and that they soak up all of that nice juice that's in there now, the juice from the onions and the mushrooms and the garlic and the ginger and of course that added seasoning and soy sauce and oyster sauce. Now, this bit is not necessary, but my neighbor lets me harvest his bay tree whenever it grows out. So I always have fresh or fresh dried bay leaves about. There is some discussion as to whether or not adding bay leaves actually make a difference to your meal, but it's a habit I've developed and I put them in everything, and I honestly do think it makes a difference. Don't forget to take them out before eating. Now, if I wasn't having this meal, I'd add some red bell pepper at this point, but I really don't like them. Everyone else in my house does. I don't get it. I love chilies. I just don't like bell peppers, so I won't be adding them to this dish. So I'm just going to let this simmer for a couple more minutes and then in with our beautiful greens and reds. They just really brighten up this dish. Obviously when they wilt down they do darken a bit, but you still get the flavors and some of the color still manages to shine through. See, if we had added those red bell peppers, you'd have that beautiful red color of them coming through, as they don't really change color when they're cooking. But that's not good enough reason for me to put them in. So I'm just going to cover this again and let that simmer for a few more minutes while I have a quick tidy up, and then it's time to prepare the broth or the liquid for the soup. Now, I do normally, and I think I still do, have quite a few bags of frozen broth in the freezer, but that is mostly a bone broth, and I don't want to use that today. So I'm just going to add some parsley to this. Again, I add parsley to pretty much everything. I do find that not only does it help with the flavors, but it also helps with digestion. Now, I'm just using these vegetable stocks today. As I said, this is a vegetarian dish only, so that's another reason not to use the bone broth, I guess. And you could add a beef broth or basically whatever stock that you wanted to at this point, even a chicken one. And I'm just going to give that a good stir in with some hot water and get that all ready to go in while everything else simmers. Now, I have turned that down to low now. It's probably on a 2. Apparently this water wasn't quite hot enough, so I'm going to have to give it a good stir in, and if I don't get everything incorporated, once it heats up with the actual mixture, it will do the rest of its thing in there for me. Back over at our pan, and everything has cooked down lovely. I honestly wish you guys could smell this right now. So I'm going to add my stock in. Now, I've only used half the liquid so far, just while I was mixing that stock. So I will be adding more as I go along. So I'm going to top this up with a bit of hot water, give it a quick taste. So I'll add a little bit more water. Again, I'm probably going to keep adding water as I go along. Give that a good stir in, and again, have a little taste. Don't forget to taste as you go along. Now, I think this could do with a little more seasoning, so I'm going to add a little bit more salt. Now, the stock is quite salty actually, so I'm going to add a little bit of soy sauce again. Not only does that add the beautiful taste, it also enriches that color. That's my little dude coming to visit me in the kitchen. Or no, he's not. He's coming to visit the fridge, of course. Now, it was quite bitter, so I added just under a tablespoon of sugar. Now, this is a hot and sour soup rather than a sweet and sour soup, so you don't want to add too much sugar, as it will just turn it into a sweet and hot sauce, I guess. Now, unfortunately, I'd obviously hit stop filming on my Apple Watch and not realize for this bit, but in order to get that sour bit, I added about half of a lemon, or squeeze of half a lemon, and about quarter of a lime, and gave that a good stir in. And again, that has just made that smell pop, those flavors pop. I find that the lime actually goes much better with the ginger than the lemon does. As I said, this smells absolutely amazing, but just to make sure, time for a quick taste test. That is absolutely gorgeous. You should try some. Now, you could actually just enjoy this soup as is at the moment, or add some already made noodles or vegan noodles, but I'm going to give making my own another go, see if I can get it right this time. And I've just got 1 egg, and I'm going to give that a good mix up. Now, you can add milk at this point, but I like to add just a little splash of water. Give that a good mix in, and I'm going to add flour slowly until I get a slightly thick pancake batter consistency. And then I've just got a Ziploc bag for this. If you had one of those cake icing doodads, I'm sure you could use that as well. However, I have put mine away with the baking stuff, as we have no more birthdays this year. Now, back over at my soup, yeah. Now, normally to get the noodles perfect, you would need to raise the temperature of the soup, but because I don't want to raise it too much and destroy all the goodies, I'm not sure it's going to work perfectly. So I just snipped a tiny corner, and I'm just squirting it in. and letting the heat of the soup cook it. Now, if the soup was at a rolling boil, it was hotter, the noodles would probably be more noodly. But this is perfect. Might not have worked, the way it should do. However, we are still getting the noodles in our soup. So now it's just time to serve up that gorgeous soup. While it's actually in there cooking, while the noodles are cooking, they do soak up all the juices as well. So they have an amazing flavor. I'm not usually a fan of just straight up noodles or ramen, as I find that they're kind of tasteless. But doing it this way, they do have time to soak up all those juices, and they're very, very tasty. So last thing to do is to serve up and go enjoy our soup. I can't wait to try this. It smells amazing. Pass it by hubby, see what he thinks. Luckily, like me, he does like a little bit of heat, but nothing too hot. And this is just perfect, and I can already feel my nose clearing, and I don't think this cold is going to stick around too much longer. Let us know if you guys like this recipe, if you give it a go, any different variations of it you've tried, or other mushrooms that you really enjoy in it, any other ingredients. I think next time I am going to try it with miso soup instead of the stock, as I've just ordered some more miso paste. I'm also looking into how to make miso myself, so that'll probably be one of our next videos. There's just some extra bits that I need to source, so I'm going to Amazon that one. But again, thank you guys for coming back to the Herbathicary, and please give us a like and subscribe if you like the videos. If you have a look through my list, I've got loads on foraging and recipes and DIYs and crochet and lots of goodies. Go have a look and see if there's anything that interests you, and hopefully we'll see you again in our next video. Thank you. Bye. Enjoy.